They say there are moments in life that change you, moments so profound, so unexpected, that they rewrite the very essence of who you are. These aren't the kind of moments you can just brush off or forget. No, they dig into your soul and stay there, no matter how much time passes or how hard you try to move on. I'd heard people talk about these life-altering experiences before, but I never really got it. Not until that day. The day I walked into a scene that tore apart everything I thought I knew about myself, my family, and the life I'd built. It's been months since that awful afternoon, but the memory still clings to me like a shadow. It plays on a loop in my mind, like some twisted movie I never signed up for but can't stop watching. Even now, I can recall every detail as if it happened yesterday. The air in the house felt heavy, almost suffocating, like the kind of stillness that makes your skin crawl. It wasn't peaceful, it was the kind of quiet that feels wrong, like the world is holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. I wasn't looking for trouble that day. I wasn't snooping around or trying to uncover some dark secret. I was just trying to get through another lonely Saturday, same as always. But then I heard it, a sound. At first, it was so faint I almost missed it, but it was there. And it wasn't the kind of noise you could just ignore. It came from down the hallway, and it stopped me dead in my tracks. My heart started racing, though I couldn't figure out why. There was no reason for the sudden wave of dread that washed over me, no explanation for the knot of fear tightening in my chest. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the TV was on in another room, or the old floors were just creaking like they always do. But deep down, I knew better. Something inside me, some gut instinct, was pulling me forward, even though every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to turn around. My steps were slow, almost reluctant, like my body was fighting against itself. I didn't want to go, but I couldn't stop. I made my way toward Ethan's room, each step bringing me closer to something I couldn't yet understand. A cold, heavy feeling settled in my stomach, gnawing at me, but I couldn't bring myself to turn back. I kept telling myself to stop, to walk away, but my feet wouldn't listen. And then, finally, I reached the door. What I saw when I opened it was beyond anything I could have imagined. It was like time itself froze. The world around me blurred, and all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing and the pounding of my heart. My chest tightened, and I felt like my heart was trying to break free from my ribcage. It was a sight I could never have prepared for, a sight that shattered every illusion I'd ever had about my life. For a split second, I was completely paralyzed. My mind went blank, refusing to process what was right in front of me. And then, when reality finally hit, it hit hard, like a freight train slamming into me. It wasn't just the scene itself, though. It was the look on his face, the fear, the vulnerability, the way his eyes locked onto mine. In that moment, I could see it all, the pain, the desperation, the silent plea for me to fix it, to make it all go away. My mind was screaming at me to leave, to pretend I'd never seen any of it, to erase the whole moment from existence. But I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the spot, like they'd been glued there. I didn't know what to say or how to feel. All I knew was that something inside me had shifted, and I could feel it, a change so deep and unsettling that I knew nothing would ever be the same again. You think you know yourself, right? You think you've got it all figured out, how you'd react, what you'd do in any given situation. But the truth is, you don't really know until you're standing in the middle of something so far outside your imagination that it forces you to make a choice you never saw coming. That was the moment I realized how little I actually knew about myself, and how much I was about to learn. Let me tell you something, the decisions I made that day, the ones that felt like they could have gone either way, still haunt me. I can't even begin to explain the weight of it, the way it clings to me like a second skin. This isn't just a story about that one life-altering moment, though. No, it's about everything that came after. The guilt that settled over me like a suffocating fog, the confusion that twisted my thoughts, and the lies I told myself just to keep going. This is a story about how a single choice, a split second of hesitation or clarity, can send shockwaves through your life. It's about how one moment can shatter everything you thought you knew about yourself and the world around you. And trust me, you're going to want to hear this. It's not an easy story. It's not pretty or polished. It's raw, messy, and complicated, but it's real. It's about the parts of life we try to avoid, the things we're too scared to face, and the consequences of decisions we wish we could take back. So, if you're ready to dive into the uncomfortable, unfiltered truth of what it means to live through these moments, stick around. This is a journey you won't forget. I've been a stepmom for 3 years now. If you'd asked me 5 years ago if this was the life I saw for myself, I would have laughed. It felt like a far-off fantasy, something that would never actually happen. But here I am, trying to navigate this role, even when I'm not entirely sure what doing it right even means. It's strange, isn't it? Stepping into someone else's family, a world that's been moving long before you arrived. You do your best to carve out a space for yourself, but it's like trying to fit into a story that wasn't yours to begin with. You're not the biological mom, but you're not just a friend either. You're stuck in this awkward in-between place, never quite belonging. At first, I thought I was doing okay. I tried to be there for Ethan, my stepson. I wanted to give him the stability he deserved, to be a positive force in his life. But some days, it felt like I was just a shadow in my own home, present, but never really seen. Mark, my husband, is a good man. At least, that's what I keep telling myself. I try to convince myself that the foundation of our relationship is strong enough to handle the distance that's grown between us over time. He works hard, always has. In his mind, putting in long hours and providing for the family is enough. But the truth is, I can't remember the last time we had a real conversation, the kind where we actually connect, where we share our thoughts and feelings. Intimacy? That's become a distant memory, a faint echo of what we used to have. When he's home, it's like he's only physically there. Emotionally, he's somewhere else entirely. The walls between us have only gotten taller, and I can't help but wonder if I'm still the person he chose or just a fixture in a life that's slowly slipping away. Most evenings, it's just me and Ethan sitting at the dinner table, the silence between us thick and heavy. It's like there's this invisible barrier, something unspoken but always there, filling the space where conversation should be. Ethan's 16, caught in that awkward space between childhood and adulthood. I can see him trying to figure it all out, but he's distant, withdrawn. He doesn't open up much, but when he does, there's a rawness in his voice, a sadness I can't quite put my finger on. It's like he's carrying something heavy, something he's not ready to share. I try to connect with him, to bridge the gap between us. I ask about his day, his friends, anything to start a conversation. But his answers are always short, guarded, like he's holding something back. I can tell there's more going on beneath the surface, but I don't push. I get it, I'm not his mom. I came into his life after his parents' messy divorce, and I'm sure part of him resents me for that. I don't blame him. Our house is beautiful, but it feels hollow. The walls are perfect, the furniture just right, but there's no warmth, no life. It's like we're all just existing in the same space, physically together but emotionally miles apart. Lately, I've been overwhelmed by this deep, aching loneliness. It's hard to explain, but it's more than just being alone. It's like I'm invisible, fading into the background. Every day feels the same: wake up, go through the motions, fall into bed at night. There's no spark, no excitement, no sense of purpose. And then there's Ethan. I've started noticing little things about him, small behaviors that worry me. He's always in his room, headphones on, shutting out the world. Sometimes, late at night, I hear him pacing, muttering to himself like he's wrestling with something he can't put into words. I wish I could reach out to him, offer him some kind of comfort or guidance. But the truth is, I feel just as lost as he does. We're both stuck in this strange, uncomfortable place, trying to figure out where we fit. There's this uncomfortable silence between us, like we're both groping around in the dark, trying to find our way without a map. I've tried to give Ethan space, to let him come to me when he's ready, but deep down, I can't shake the feeling that I'm failing him. I won't lie, lately, I've felt this strange connection with Ethan, something I can't quite put into words. Maybe it's because we're both lonely, both searching for something we're not getting from the people around us. Or maybe it's because, in some ways, we're more alike than we'd care to admit. Whatever it is, it's there, hanging in the air between us, unspoken but impossible to ignore. That day started like any other. It was a rainy Saturday afternoon, the kind of day that makes you want to stay in bed with a book or binge-watch TV. Mark was out of town, again, on another business trip, and the house was eerily quiet. I was in the kitchen, half-heartedly cleaning up, when I heard it, a faint noise coming from Ethan's room. At first, I didn't think much of it. Kids make noise, right? But something about it caught my attention. It wasn't loud or obvious, just off. I paused, listening, trying to make sense of it. And then, before I could stop myself, I found my feet moving toward his room. As I got closer, the sound became clearer, and my stomach twisted into knots. I couldn't explain it, but something felt wrong. I hesitated outside his door, my hand hovering over the knob. Part of me wanted to walk away, to pretend I hadn't heard anything. But another part, curiosity, maybe, pushed me forward. I knocked softly, but there was no answer. My heart was pounding as I slowly turned the knob and stepped inside. What I saw stopped me in my tracks. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Ethan was sitting on the edge of his bed, his face flushed, his hands trembling. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and shame, and I felt my stomach drop. He started to stammer, trying to explain, but I couldn't hear the words. My mind was racing, my emotions swirling in a chaotic storm. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him it was okay, but I didn't know how. All I could see was the vulnerability in his eyes, the way he looked at me like I was the only person in the world who could make it better. And in that moment, something shifted between us, something I couldn't take back. My mind was spinning as I stood there in Ethan's room. The air felt thick, heavy, like the walls themselves were closing in on me. His wide, panicked eyes met mine, and for a split second, the world fell completely silent. I didn't even hear the rain tapping against the windows anymore. It was just him and me, frozen in this impossible moment. I wanted to speak, to say something that would break the unbearable tension hanging between us. But my throat felt dry, my words stuck somewhere deep inside. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his hands trembling as he tried to compose himself. But the look on his face told me everything. He wasn't just embarrassed, he was terrified. "Ethan," I finally managed to whisper, my voice barely audible over the storm of thoughts crashing in my head. He didn't answer. Didn't even move. He just looked at me, his expression a mixture of shame and desperation, like he was bracing himself for whatever came next. And in that moment, something broke inside me. I didn't see him as my stepson. I saw a boy, someone hurting, someone lost, someone who needed me. My instincts told me to walk away, to leave the room and pretend I hadn't seen anything. But I couldn't. I felt rooted to the spot, my heart aching in a way I couldn't fully understand. He looked so vulnerable, so fragile, and something deep inside me, the part of me that had been starving for connection, reached out before I could stop it. "I'm not mad," I said softly, taking a cautious step toward him. "It's okay, Ethan. You don't have to be scared." His lips parted as if he wanted to say something, but no words came. Instead, he just stared at me, his eyes glassy with unshed tears. And in that moment, I realized he wasn't just embarrassed. He was broken, carrying a weight far heavier than any teenager should have to bear. I sat down on the edge of the bed, careful to keep a respectful distance. The room was quiet except for the sound of our breathing, uneven and shaky. I wanted to reach out, to put a comforting hand on his shoulder, but I hesitated, unsure if it would make things better or worse. "Talk to me," I said gently. "Whatever it is, I promise I'll understand." For a moment, it seemed like he might open up. His mouth twitched, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. But then he shook his head, his voice barely a whisper. "You wouldn't understand." Those words hit me harder than I expected. He didn't know it, but I understood more than he realized. The loneliness, the confusion, the desperate need to feel seen, I knew it all too well. I'd been living it every single day in this house, hiding it behind a mask of polite smiles and hollow conversations. "I might surprise you," I said, trying to keep my tone light, but my chest felt tight. "Whatever you're feeling, Ethan, it's okay. You're not alone." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a moment, I saw something in his eyes, something raw and unguarded. I couldn't quite name what I saw in Ethan's eyes. It wasn't just relief or gratitude, it was something deeper, something I wasn't ready to face. The rain outside grew heavier, pounding against the windows like a heartbeat. The room felt thick with unspoken words and emotions neither of us knew how to name. As I sat there, watching Ethan struggle with whatever was tearing him apart, I felt a storm of emotions I couldn't begin to untangle. On one hand, I wanted to protect him, to shield him from the pain he was carrying. But on the other hand, there was something about the way he looked at me, something raw and vulnerable, that awakened a part of me I hadn't felt in years. It was terrifying, confusing, and I hated myself for even thinking it. But it was there, undeniable and electric. I don't know how long we sat there in silence, the storm outside mirroring the one brewing inside. But eventually, Ethan spoke, his voice trembling. "I'm sorry," he said, his words barely more than a whisper. "I didn't mean for you to see that." "You don't have to apologize," I replied quickly, my voice soft but firm. "You're not in trouble, Ethan. Everyone has moments like this. It's normal." He shook his head, his expression darkening. "It's not normal. I'm not normal." The pain in his voice was like a knife to my heart. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that he was perfect just the way he was, but the words felt too big, too loaded for the moment. Instead, I reached out, placing a hand gently on his arm. "Ethan," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos in my chest, you are normal. And you don't have to go through this alone. Whatever you're feeling, whatever you're dealing with, I'm here. You can trust me. His eyes searched mine, as if trying to decide whether I meant it. In that moment, I realized just how much he needed someone to believe in him, to see him for who he was and not for the mistakes he thought defined him. The silence stretched between us, heavy but not uncomfortable, as the rain continued to fall. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was a turning point, not just for Ethan, but for me, too. Something had shifted between us, something I couldn't ignore. And deep down, I knew that whatever came next, there would be no going back. I wish I could tell you that I walked out of that room right then and there, that I said something comforting and reassuring and left Ethan to process whatever he was going through. But the truth is so much messier, so much harder to admit. I couldn't move. I couldn't make myself leave. There was this pull, this strange magnetism that I couldn't explain, and it kept me rooted to that spot, sitting on the edge of his bed while the storm outside lashed against the windows. My mind was screaming at me, telling me to go, to put distance between us before things got even more complicated. But my body didn't listen. Maybe it was the loneliness. God, the loneliness. I don't think I've ever felt so invisible in my life as I have in the past few years. My husband, Mark, stopped noticing me long before I even realized it. At first, I thought it was just the stress of work, the grind of daily life. But then days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and before I knew it, I'd become a fixture in the background of his life, there, but not really seen. And Ethan? Ethan saw me. Not as a stepmom, not as a placeholder in this family, but as a person. He looked at me like I mattered, like I was someone who could make a difference. And in that moment, with his eyes full of confusion and fear and something I couldn't quite name, I felt something shift inside me. I told myself it was maternal instinct, that I just wanted to protect him, to help him navigate whatever he was going through. But deep down, I knew it was more complicated than that. There was something in the way he looked at me, something that made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I tried to tell myself that this was just a moment, a fleeting blip that I would move past. But as I sat there, the air between us thick with unspoken words and emotions I didn't want to name, I knew it wasn't that simple. Ethan, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper, you're not alone in this. I'm here for you. His gaze softened, and for the first time, I saw the faintest hint of relief in his eyes. He nodded, but he didn't say anything. And in that silence, my mind went to war with itself. One part of me, the rational part, was screaming at me to get up, to leave the room, to put as much distance between us as possible. But another part, a darker, more selfish part, wanted to stay, wanted to feel needed, wanted to feel seen. I told myself it was innocent, that I was just being supportive. But the way his eyes lingered on mine, the way the space between us felt charged, made it impossible to lie to myself. The guilt hit me like a tidal wave, but it wasn't enough to drown out the ache I felt deep in my chest. I'd spent so long feeling invisible, so long pretending I was okay, that this moment, this connection, felt like a lifeline. Even if it was wrong, even if it was messy and complicated and something I'd regret later, I couldn't bring myself to let it go. The storm outside raged on, a perfect reflection of the chaos inside me. I thought about Mark, about the vows I'd made, about the life we'd built together. But those thoughts felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. Here, in this room, it was just me and Ethan, and the weight of everything unsaid between us. You don't have to talk about it if you're not ready, I said softly. But just know I'm here for you. No matter what. He nodded again, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched out between us, heavy but not uncomfortable. And as I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd crossed an invisible line, one we couldn't uncross. That night, after Ethan had gone to bed, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the rain streaking down the windows. My mind replayed the moment over and over, dissecting every glance, every word, every feeling. Why hadn't I walked away? Why had I stayed? And more importantly, why did a part of me wish I could go back to that room and relive it all over again? The guilt was suffocating, but it wasn't enough to drown out the other emotions bubbling just beneath the surface, the loneliness, the longing, the desperate need to feel connected to someone. It all came crashing down on me like a wave, pulling me under. I tried to tell myself that it was nothing, that it didn't mean anything. But deep down, I knew better. Something had changed that day, something I couldn't undo. And as much as I hated myself for it, a part of me didn't want to. I barely slept that night, my thoughts racing as the storm outside finally began to fade. When morning came, I told myself I'd move past it, that I'd bury the moment deep inside and never let it see the light of day. But even as I made that promise to myself, I knew it wouldn't be that easy. Some moments don't just fade away, they stick with you, haunting you, reminding you of the choices you made and the ones you didn't. And as much as I wanted to pretend otherwise, I knew this was one of those moments. The days that followed felt like I was walking through a dream, or maybe a nightmare. One where the edges of reality blurred, and nothing made sense anymore. Every moment in the house seemed charged, every interaction with Ethan laced with a tension we both felt but refused to name. It started small, almost innocently. At least, that's what I told myself. Ethan would linger in the kitchen when I was making dinner, leaning against the counter and asking me about my day in a way that felt different. Before, his responses to me were short and guarded. But now, he seemed curious, almost eager to talk. He asked me about my favorite books, my childhood, the things I used to dream about before life became, well, this. And every time he asked, I couldn't help but feel like he was trying to peel back the layers of who I was, to see the version of me I'd buried long ago. I should have shut it down. I knew I should have. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself answering his questions, sharing parts of myself I hadn't shared with anyone in years, not even my husband. I told myself it was harmless, that I was just being a good stepmom, that I was helping him feel less alone. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The glances grew longer. The touches, though accidental at first, lingered a fraction too long. Once, as I reached across the table to pass him the salad bowl, our hands brushed, and neither of us pulled away right away. It was such a small moment, something that shouldn't have meant anything. But the way his eyes flicked up to meet mine, the way my breath caught in my chest, it was like a silent acknowledgement of the line we were towing. The tension was unbearable, but it wasn't the kind of tension that makes you want to escape. It was the kind that pulls you in, like a magnetic force you can't fight. And the more I tried to tell myself it was wrong, the more I found myself craving those moments, those fleeting seconds where it felt like we were the only two people in the world who understood each other. Ethan started finding excuses to be near me. He'd wander into the living room when I was folding laundry, sitting on the couch and asking if I needed help. He'd hover in the doorway when I was cleaning the kitchen, pretending to be looking for a snack but never actually taking anything. And every time, I felt that same pull, that same intoxicating mix of guilt and longing that left me breathless. One evening, Mark was working late, and it was just me and Ethan in the house. I was in the living room, curled up on the couch with a blanket, trying to lose myself in a movie. I thought I'd have the evening to myself, but then Ethan appeared, his hair tousled and his expression hesitant. "What are you watching?" he asked, his voice casual but his eyes cautious, like he was testing the waters. "Just some old film," I replied, trying to sound nonchalant. "Nothing special." He hesitated for a moment, then walked over and sat down on the other end of the couch. "Mind if I join you?" I should have said no. I should have told him to go do his homework or watch something in his room. But instead, I nodded, shifting slightly to make room for him. The movie played on, but I couldn't focus on the screen. I was hyper-aware of him sitting next to me, of the way the couch dipped slightly under his weight, of the warmth radiating from his side of the blanket. At one point, a particularly emotional scene played out on the screen, a couple confessing their love for each other in the rain, and I felt him glance at me out of the corner of his eye. "Do you think love is really like that?" he asked suddenly, his voice quiet but filled with something I couldn't quite place. I turned to him, caught off guard by the question. "Like what?" "Like, perfect. Like it can fix everything." I hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I think love is messy," I said finally. "It's not perfect, and it doesn't fix everything. But when it's real, it's worth the mess." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a moment, I felt like he could see straight through me, past all the walls I'd built to keep people out. The moment stretched on, and I knew I should say something, do something, to break the spell. But I couldn't. And then, just as quickly as it began, the moment passed. He turned back to the screen, his expression unreadable, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. That night, after Ethan had gone to bed, I sat in the darkened living room, my mind racing. I told myself that nothing had happened, that it was just an innocent moment between a stepmother and her stepson. But the way my heart had raced, the way my skin had burned where his arm had brushed against mine, it was anything but innocent. The days that followed only made things more complicated. Ethan started texting me during the day, little messages that were innocent enough on the surface but felt loaded with meaning. "How's your day going?" What's for dinner tonight? Do you need help with anything around the house? And every time my phone buzzed, I felt that same mix of excitement and guilt that had become all too familiar. I knew we were heading toward a breaking point, that the line we'd been towing was about to snap. But I couldn't stop. Every interaction, every glance, every touch felt like a thread pulling us closer together. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't untangle myself from it. And the worst part? A small, selfish part of me didn't want to. It all came to a head on a Thursday night, the kind of evening where everything feels off balance before anything even happens. Mark was on another one of his endless business trips, the house eerily quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards. Ethan had been in his room all evening, and I was in the living room, trying to distract myself with a comedy on TV. But my thoughts kept circling back to him, to the tension that had been building between us like a storm waiting to break. When he came downstairs, his hair still damp from a shower and his sweatshirt slightly wrinkled, I felt my heart skip a beat. He hesitated in the doorway, one hand gripping the frame as though he wasn't sure if he should come in. "Hey," he said, his voice soft but steady. "What are you watching?" "Some dumb movie," I replied, forcing a smile. "Nothing special." "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his eyes meeting mine in a way that felt like a challenge, like he was daring me to say no. I should have told him to go back to his room or made up some excuse about needing time alone. But instead, I scooted over, patting the empty spot on the couch beside me. He walked over slowly, almost cautiously, and sat down, leaving just enough space between us to keep things innocent, or so I told myself. The movie played on, but neither of us was really watching. The air between us felt thick, heavy with everything unsaid, every glance that lingered a second too long. I tried to focus on the screen, on the bright colors and the laugh track, but my mind kept drifting to the warmth of his presence beside me, the faint scent of his shampoo, the way his leg was just inches from mine. And then it happened. A scene in the movie, two characters confessing their feelings for each other in a moment of vulnerability. It hit too close to home. The dialogue was raw, honest, cutting through the tension with words that neither Ethan nor I had dared to speak aloud. I felt him shift beside me, his body tensing. When I turned to look at him, I saw something in his eyes that made my breath catch. It was a question, a plea, 1,000 emotions all tangled together. And before I could stop myself, I was leaning toward him, closing the small distance between us. "This is wrong," a voice in my head screamed. But it was drowned out by the pounding of my heart, the electricity buzzing in the air between us. I was close enough to see the faint freckles on his nose, the way his lips parted slightly as he tried to form words that wouldn't come. "Ethan," I whispered, my voice shaking. "We can't." But before I could finish, he closed the distance, his lips brushing mine in a kiss that was soft, hesitant, and yet filled with a desperation that mirrored my own. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The weight of everything fell away as we gave into the pull that had been building for weeks, maybe months. And then reality came crashing back. I pulled away, my heart racing, my mind screaming at me to say something, anything, that would make this go away. But the look in Ethan's eyes, the mixture of fear, longing, and something deeper, rendered me speechless. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I shouldn't have." "No," I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. This can't happen." He looked down, his shoulders slumping, and I felt a pang of guilt so deep it nearly knocked the breath out of me. I wanted to comfort him, to say something that would make it all okay, but there was nothing I could say that wouldn't make it worse. "I think you should go to bed," I said finally, my voice trembling. "We'll talk in the morning." He nodded, his movements slow and reluctant. And when he finally stood and walked away, I felt an ache in my chest that I couldn't explain. I sat there on the couch long after he'd gone, staring at the darkened TV screen, my mind replaying the moment over and over. What had I done? How had I let it get this far? I thought about Mark, about the vows I'd made, about the life we'd built together. But no matter how hard I tried to focus on those things, my thoughts kept circling back to Ethan, to the look in his eyes, to the way his touch had made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. I told myself it was a mistake, a moment of weakness that would never happen again. But deep down, I knew the truth. The line we'd crossed couldn't be uncrossed. And no matter how hard I tried to pretend otherwise, everything had changed. The next morning, I woke up with a pit in my stomach so heavy it felt like I'd swallowed a stone. The events of the night before played in my mind like a bad dream, but it wasn't a dream. It was real. And the weight of that realization nearly crushed me. I couldn't even bring myself to look in the mirror. What would I see staring back at me? A broken woman? A coward? Or someone I didn't even recognize anymore? The house was painfully quiet. Normally, I'd hear Ethan shuffling around by now, the sound of his footsteps on the stairs or the faint music he always had playing in his room. But this morning, there was nothing. Just silence. I forced myself to go through the motions, making coffee, tidying up the kitchen, anything to distract myself from the suffocating guilt. But no matter what I did, I couldn't stop thinking about the way Ethan had looked at me last night, the vulnerability, the longing, and the unspoken question in his eyes. I couldn't avoid him forever, though. Eventually, I made my way upstairs and stood outside his door, my hand hovering over the knob. Part of me wanted to knock, to try to fix whatever had broken between us. But another part of me was terrified. What would I even say? How could I make this right? Before I could decide, the door creaked open just a crack and Ethan's face appeared. His eyes were red, like he hadn't slept, and his expression was a mix of shame and something else, something I couldn't quite name. "Hey," I said softly, my voice barely audible. He didn't say anything, just nodded slightly before stepping back and closing the door again. I stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door, feeling more helpless than I ever had in my life. I wanted to fix this, to rewind time and undo everything. But it was too late. The damage had been done. The hours dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Ethan stayed in his room, and I stayed in mine. The silence between us was a chasm I didn't know how to cross. Then, in the early evening, I heard the familiar sound of Mark's car pulling into the driveway. I panicked. I hadn't even thought about how I'd act around Mark, about how I'd hide the guilt and shame that were written all over me. I took a deep breath, plastered on a smile, and went downstairs to greet him. "Hey, honey," he said, kissing me on the cheek as he walked in. "How were things while I was gone?" "Fine," I replied quickly, my voice unnaturally cheerful. "Quiet, as usual." Ethan came downstairs a few minutes later, his face blank, his movements stiff. He muttered a quick hello to Mark before grabbing a soda from the fridge and retreating back to his room. Mark didn't seem to notice anything unusual, but I could feel the weight of Ethan's silence pressing down on me like a lead blanket. Dinner that night was unbearable. Mark chattered about work, completely oblivious to the tension hanging in the air. I nodded along, forcing myself to laugh at his jokes, but every time I glanced at Ethan, my stomach churned. He wouldn't look at me, wouldn't even glance in my direction, and the guilt was almost too much to bear. After dinner, I found myself sitting alone in the living room, staring at the TV but not really watching. My mind was spinning, replaying every moment of the past few days, every mistake I'd made, every line I'd crossed. I felt like I was drowning, the weight of my guilt pulling me under. And I didn't know how to come up for air. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw Ethan standing in the doorway, his expression guarded, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his sweatshirt. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. I nodded, my heart pounding as he walked into the room and sat down on the other end of the couch. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence was deafening, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Ethan," I started, but he cut me off. "No, let me finish," he said, his eyes meeting mine for the first time since the night before. "I messed up. I don't know what I was thinking. I don't know." He looked away, his shoulders slumping, and I felt a pang of sadness so deep it nearly took my breath away. "It's not your fault," I said softly, my voice trembling. "I'm the adult here. I should have stopped it before it went too far." He shook his head, his jaw tightening. "It doesn't matter. We can't just pretend like it didn't happen." "I know," I said, my chest tightening. "I know we can't, but we have to find a way to move past it, for both our sakes." The conversation ended there. The silence stretched out between us once again. Ethan went back to his room, and I sat there alone, feeling more lost than ever. That night, as I lay in bed beside Mark, I couldn't stop thinking about Ethan, about the mistakes I'd made, about the lines I'd crossed. I knew things would never be the same, but I didn't know how to fix it. And the worst part? A small, selfish part of me didn't want to. I've played that night in my mind 1,000 times, and every time, it feels like I'm peeling back another layer of myself I didn't even know existed. I try to analyze it, break it apart, make sense of how I got here. But the harder I look, the more fragmented it becomes. Was it loneliness? That deep, aching emptiness I've carried with me for years, the feeling of being invisible in my own home, my own marriage? Mark used to see me, really see me. He used to make me feel like I was the center of his world. But now I'm just part of the furniture, something that's there but no longer worth noticing. Or was it desperation? A cry for help, maybe, a way to feel something, anything, when my days have become a monotonous blur of routines and responsibilities? There's something about feeling needed, about someone looking at you like you're the answer to their unspoken questions, that's intoxicating. Ethan looked at me like that. And for a fleeting moment, I felt alive in a way I haven't felt in years. But then there's the darker possibility, the one I'm too afraid to say out loud, even to myself. What if it wasn't just loneliness or desperation? What if it was something deeper, something selfish and ugly that I don't want to admit exists inside me? What kind of person does this make me? Every time I think about Ethan, about the way he looked at me, the way he trusted me, I feel this crushing weight of guilt. I was supposed to protect him, to guide him, to be the adult in the room. Instead, I let my own emotions, my own weaknesses, take over. I crossed a line I can never uncross. And it's tearing me apart. At night, when the house is quiet and Mark is asleep beside me, I lie awake, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts running in circles. I think about the moment I leaned in, the moment I chose to ignore the voice in my head screaming at me to stop. I wonder if I could have done something different, if I could have avoided all of this. But no matter how many times I replay it, I always end up in the same place. And then there's Ethan. I can't stop thinking about him, about the look on his face that night, the vulnerability and confusion that mirrored my own. He's a kid, barely old enough to understand what he's feeling, and I put him in a position he should have never been in. How do I fix that? How do I undo the damage I've done? The worst part is, I can't talk to anyone about it. I can't confide in Mark. How could I? He'd never understand, and even if he did, it would destroy him. I can't talk to a friend, can't tell a therapist. This is a secret I have to carry alone. And it feels like it's eating me alive. I've started to notice things about myself, little changes that scare me. I flinch when Mark touches me, guilt twisting in my stomach at even the smallest gestures of affection. I avoid looking at myself in the mirror for too long, afraid of the person staring back at me. I've even caught myself snapping at Ethan for no reason, as though pushing him away will somehow make this easier. But it doesn't. If anything, it makes it worse. Because no matter how hard I try to distance myself, no matter how much I tell myself that I need to put space between us, there's still a part of me that aches for those moments when he looked at me like I mattered. And that's the real dilemma, isn't it? How do I reconcile these two sides of myself? The side that knows what I did was wrong, and the side that still craves the connection I felt in those fleeting moments. How do I move forward when I'm torn between guilt and longing, between regret and desire? Some days, I think about leaving, packing a bag, walking out the door, and starting over somewhere far away, where no one knows me, where I can pretend this never happened. But then I think about Ethan, about what that would do to him, and I know I can't. I've tried to rationalize it, to tell myself that everyone makes mistakes, that this was just a moment of weakness. But no matter how hard I try, I can't shake the feeling that this was more than that. This was a choice I made, knowing full well what the consequences would be. I keep asking myself, what would you do if you were me? Would you confess, rip the bandage off, and deal with the fallout? Or would you bury it deep, lock it away in a part of yourself that no one ever sees, and try to move on? But even as I ask the question, I know there's no right answer. Because no matter what I do, the damage has already been done. Ethan and I crossed a line we can never go back from. And now, we're both left to navigate the wreckage. Every day feels like a balancing act, like I'm walking a tightrope between the life I had and the one I shattered. And I don't know how much longer I can keep it up. Because the truth is, no matter how hard I try to pretend otherwise, I'm not the person I thought I was. And that realization? It's the hardest part of all. I know this story isn't easy to hear. It wasn't easy to tell. I've spent countless sleepless nights trying to piece together what happened, trying to make sense of the choices I made and the consequences I have to live with every single day. And as much as I'd like to think I'm alone in this, I know I'm not. Life has a way of throwing us into situations we're not prepared for, moments where the lines blur, and what's right and wrong doesn't seem as clear-cut as it should. Moments where our emotions, our needs, our weaknesses take over, and we find ourselves standing at a crossroads we never expected. I want to hear from you. Have you ever faced a moment like that? A moment where everything felt wrong but also inevitable, like you were caught in a storm you couldn't control? How did you handle it? Did you try to fix it? Bury it? Or did you let it consume you? Maybe your story is nothing like mine. Maybe it's not about infidelity or guilt, but about something else that haunts you, something that made you question who you are and what you're capable of. Whatever it is, I want you to share it. Because if there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that we don't have to carry these burdens alone. And if you're sitting there listening to this story and thinking, how could she do that? Or I'd never let myself get into that situation, I understand. It's easy to judge when you're on the outside looking in. But I'd still love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done if you were me? Would you have walked away the moment you felt the tension building, put up a wall and kept it from going any further? Would you have confessed to someone, hoping the truth would set you free? Or would you have buried it, carrying the weight of it with you and hoping it would fade with time? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I'm not just asking out of curiosity. I genuinely want to know. Your words might help me make sense of what I've been through, or, at the very least, remind me that I'm not alone in this. If this story resonated with you in any way, or even if it made you uncomfortable, I hope you'll stick around. I want this channel to be a place where we can have these difficult conversations, where we can explore the raw, messy sides of life that no one likes to talk about but everyone has experienced in some way. So, please, like this video if it spoke to you. Share it with someone who might need to hear it. And subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Life isn't always neat and tidy. It's complicated. It's chaotic. And sometimes, it's downright heartbreaking. But that's what makes it worth talking about. I'm looking forward to hearing from you in the comments. And I'll be reading every single one. Thank you for taking the time to listen, for letting me share a piece of my story with you. No matter what you're going through, just remember, you're not alone. Sometimes, the choices we make in a moment of weakness define us more than the ones we make in strength. I've come to realize that it's not the grand decisions, the ones we plan and think through, that shape who we are. It's the split-second choices, the ones made in the heat of emotion, the ones we think won't matter in the long run, that leave the deepest marks on us. If I could go back, would I change what happened? The obvious answer is yes. But the truth is, I don't know. That's the part that haunts me the most. It's easy to look back and say, I should have done this differently. But in the moment, it felt like I wasn't in control at all, like I was being swept up by something bigger than myself. Looking back, I've learned that some lines aren't just crossed, they're shattered. You can't take them back together, no matter how hard you try. And the fragments don't just cut you, they cut the people you care about, the people who trusted you, who believed in you. Ethan may never fully understand the weight of what happened, but I do. And that weight is something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. Let my story be a cautionary tale. The things we think we want in the moment, the connection, the validation, the fleeting sense of being seen, can haunt us for a lifetime. They don't fill the void we think they will. They just make it bigger, darker, more impossible to escape. I wish I could tell you that I figured it all out, that I found a way to move forward and leave it all behind. But I haven't. Every time I look at Mark, I feel like I'm lying to him, even if he doesn't know it. Every time I see Ethan, I feel the sting of guilt and the unshakable realization that I failed in the worst way possible. What's worse is the lingering question, who am I now? Because I can't look at myself the same way anymore. I used to think of myself as a good person, someone who might make mistakes but always had the best intentions. Now, I'm not so sure. The mirror has become my enemy, a reflection of someone I don't fully recognize. There's a lesson in this, I think, but it's not an easy one. It's not tied up in a neat little bow with a clear moral at the end. Life isn't like that. Life is messy and complicated and full of gray areas. But if I've learned anything, it's that the choices we make, even the small ones, can ripple out in ways we never imagined. They can hurt people we never meant to hurt, change relationships we thought were unshakable, and leave scars that never fully heal. I've also learned that guilt doesn't go away just because you bury it. You can try to push it down, hide it, pretend it doesn't exist. But it always finds a way back to the surface. It's there in the quiet moments, in the pauses between conversations, in the dreams that wake you up in a cold sweat. And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe guilt is the price we pay for our mistakes, the thing that keeps us human. To anyone listening, I hope you take something from my story. Maybe it's a warning. Maybe it's a reminder to think twice before you act. Or maybe it's just the knowledge that you're not alone in your struggles. We all have moments we wish we could take back. Moments we'd give anything to redo. But we can't. All we can do is try to learn from them, try to be better, and try to forgive ourselves, even if it feels impossible. I still don't know what the future holds. I don't know if I'll ever fully repair the damage I've done or if I'll ever feel like myself again. But I do know this, I have to try. For Mark, for Ethan, for myself. Because the alternative, letting this mistake define me, letting it consume me, is something I'm not willing to accept. So, if you're standing at a crossroads, If you're feeling pulled towards something you know you shouldn't, take a moment. Breathe. Think about the people who will be affected, the consequences that will follow. Because trust me, the price of that fleeting moment of connection, of validation, isn't worth the pain it leaves behind. Thank you for listening to my story, for letting me share this part of myself with you. I don't know what you'll take away from it, but I hope it's something that stays with you, something that helps you make a choice you can live with. And if you've ever found yourself in a moment like this, I want you to know that you're not alone. We're all human, flawed and messy, and trying our best to navigate this complicated thing called life. But together, maybe we can find a way to carry the weight of our mistakes and keep moving forward. If this story spoke to you, if it made you feel something or reminded you of your own struggles, I'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's start a conversation. Because sometimes, the hardest things to talk about are the things we need to talk about the most. And if you're new here, please consider subscribing. This channel is a space for real stories, raw emotions, and the messy truths that make us who we are. Life isn't perfect, but that's what makes it worth sharing. Thank you for being here.